Welcome to Stream of Conscience, brought to you by Democracy for America, Fairfield County, where we believe that change is possible and you can make it happen. I'm your host, John Hartwell. Our guest today is Connecticut Secretary of the State, Denise Merrill, and in that role, she's the Chief Elections Official and Business Registrar of the state. Denise graduated from UConn and was first elected to the State House in a special election in 1993. She rose to become co-chair of the Appropriations Committee and then succeeded Chris Donovan as Majority Leader, a position she left after only one term to run for Secretary of State. The Secretary of the State has traditionally had a key role in setting public policy on elections, and on Martin Luther King Day, Denise and Governor Dan Malloy announced legislation to streamline voter registration, including Election Day registration, online registration, broader use of absentee ballots, and increased penalties for voter intimidation. Denise, welcome to Stream of Conscience.
Thanks, John. Good to be here.
So I know that you've been out and about in the state talking to people about all the reforms that you want to bring as Secretary of State to Election Day, to the voter registration, and to how people vote. Tell us what's in store.
Well, so far it's being extremely well received, I have to say. I'm determined that we pay attention to the next generation of voters. That's the way I look at it. We need to do more to get people registered and voting in this state. We don't have a sterling record on this, and some of our laws are the most restrictive in the country. So unlike what's going on in many other states, we want to reduce barriers to voting. And there are some.
So what are the most important barriers in your mind?
I think our registration system is far behind the times. I feel like we have a 19th century election system for a 21st century culture. People move a lot. It's hard to keep track of them. So I am proposing that we do something that at least 10 other states are already doing, by the way, online voter registration. This is something that is very easy to accomplish with new technology. People should be able to register to vote right online, hopefully soon on their iPhones, where we'd have an application where you can put in your own information. We can cross-check it now with all the many state voter files, including the DMV file, where there are electronic signatures on record, and that way the information's already typed in, it goes to the registrar, and this will make our voter registration far more efficient, less costly, and more accessible to the new wave of voters who are coming along.
And the new wave of voters, if we're talking about people under 30, they live on their mobile devices.
Absolutely, and so do some of the rest of us. But that's exactly right, because what we're finding is more and more younger people, and I'm talking about even people under 35, really, are not voting in as big in numbers as their previous generations. They don't feel so much that it's a duty to vote. And they want to do it the way they do everything else, which is online,
right,
quickly, easily,
yes,
and suits their lifestyle, and they understand it.
With as little transactional overhead as possible.
Exactly.
Yeah. So in addition to voter registration, what are the other barriers?
Well, we have a very unusual constitutional provision in our state constitution, which basically says you must appear in person on Election Day to vote.
Okay.
With a couple of exceptions that are somewhat well known, which is if you are planning to be absent from the jurisdiction at all times of Election Day, then you can get an absentee ballot.
Okay.
And if you're disabled, and there's a few other incidences. This is a very weird provision, frankly, in our Constitution. Usually such things are in statute, where they also are in Connecticut. I want to remove that language from the Constitution and put it and leave it in statute so that we can be more flexible about things like absentee ballots or early voting. 36 other states are already doing some version of some of these things. For example, Florida votes for 10 days before election. Right. And I'm sure people in Connecticut are starting to get this because as they listen to national news, they hear other states are doing things differently, and I think some of them are wondering why we're not.
And we have a lot of snowbirds who go to Florida particularly.
Exactly.
So they must be seeing it down there.
Sure.
So voter registration and absentee ballots, what's the other provision?
Well, the other thing I want to do, again, to streamline our system is Election Day registration. This is something that, again, is being done in at least 10 other states. And basically what it means is you should be able to come in on Election Day, present your identification to show you are who you are, register and vote on the spot. We can, again, we have technology now. You don't have to do all this by hand. You don't
Right.
have to send pieces of mail to people's house and wait for it to come back.
Right.
This can all be done with a touch of the button, and I'm sort of surprised that we haven't figured that out yet, to be honest.
So what are the barriers in general to getting change like this done?
I think I have pretty broad support for everything except the election day registration. I think some people think it might favor one party or another, or everyone's trying to figure out what the political advantage or disadvantage is of these things. Frankly, I think it's good for everyone. But the idea that we'd have to change our current system is hard, particularly for those who are out there, the registrars and clerks and so forth, who would have to implement the change.
Right. Well, change is never easy.
Well, they don't call us the land of steady habits for nothing. It is really difficult. And add to that the fact we don't have counties.
Right.
So you have 169 towns,
Yep.
each one running their own little election system. And it's not going to be easy, but there's a lot of support too. I mean, I think most people realize times are changing and that this really will provide access in ways that we haven't had in this state.
So is access the problem? I know that in Connecticut, only about 70% of the people who could register to vote are in fact registered. And of that number,
Right.
even in a presidential election year, not everybody turns out to vote. And I think in 2010, when Governor Malloy was elected and you were elected, that statewide it was only 57%. But that's 57% of the 70%. So there's a huge number of people who either don't register, or even if they are registered, they don't show up to vote.
These are shocking statistics. Everyone should be alarmed, first of all, by the fact that 30% of our people, and this is not just in Connecticut, this is nationwide, 30% aren't registered at all. They have already voted with their feet.
Yep.
They're not part of the system. They've bailed out. I mean, obviously, it's a very complex problem. I mean, a lot of it is deep cynicism about government, about the impact of their vote. They think it doesn't count. They see, and frankly, the impact of money on our system, which is what's making people feel like their vote doesn't count.
Certainly part of it.
Yeah.
Well, you think again back to 2010, Governor Malloy was elected by 6,400 votes out
That's
of
right.
over 1 million cast. So what would be the impact, do you think, of changing the rules so that we would have an easier form of absentee balloting, if people could in fact register on the day of elections and people could go online to register? How many more people do you think would participate?
Well, we're looking at data from other states. One good thing about being last is you have other history to look at.
Right.
And in the states that have recently passed election day registration, which I think has the most promise for increasing turnout, the increase in turnout has been between 8 and 12%. It's big.
So 8 and 12%, let's say 10% on average, and in 1 million people voting, that's 100,000 people.
That's right.
That's a huge number of people above and beyond what people are used to dealing with at the polls.
That's right.
Is that going to have an impact?
Yes, I think a positive one. I mean, the more people that participate in a democracy, the stronger we are. So I believe so strongly that this is the wave of the future, and that we ought to be looking at what the election system looks like 5 years from now, 10 years from now. We can't just look at where we are right today. That is why I think this is so important, and I think it will make a huge difference. Whenever you increase turnout, it's a good thing.
Well, I'm thinking in specifics about the running a polling place.
The procedural.
How many people you have at the polling place, what
Right.
it means in terms of election day registration. So what's your plan? If you were able to get election day registration, how exactly would that work?
Right now, well, first of all, we won't do it until the next municipal election, because I
So-
don't think we're quite ready to implement it
So
for a
2013
presidential.
would be the first time.
Right.
And in 2013, if they go along the normal route, which with no gubernatorial election, no state senate, no
special
no
elections
specials,
and all
nothing,
that.
no Congress,
Yeah,
the
it's
turnout is in fact going to be very low.
Very low.
So
Always
that
is.
would actually be a good time to test a new system, because there would be the fewest additional voters coming out anyway.
Yes.
Yes.
Although I should say that in a presidential year, the federal law requires us to give anyone who comes in a presidential ballot,
Right.
even if they're not registered.
Right.
So we have some record to go on in terms of who we think is going to show up at the last minute in some of these elections.
So how would you do it? What would be the mechanism?
Well, the way it would work is, because we still have a fairly old, that is hardline-based system. It's a closed loop. So there's only one voter registry station in each town, usually in the registrar's office. So people would be able to come only to that place, not at all the polling places. So first of all, I don't think administratively it's going to be that hard to manage, because essentially people will go to the registrar's office, register there, be put on the system, checked out, and then vote there as if it were almost like an absentee ballot.
Okay, so if they showed up they heard about election day registration and they show up at their polling place, what happens?
They would have to be sent to wherever this one station is in that city or town to get registered.
Okay.
So that's the first step. And from what we can tell, there are very few people that do this at the last minute. The problems we usually have at the polls are people who think they're on the list and they aren't, for whatever reason, usually human error. So that's why I think of the Election Day registration as a companion bill to the online voter registration. Because the first thing we need to do is make our lists much more accurate, which is what that will do. And so that alone saves a lot of hassles at the polls. I don't know if you've been there when this happens, but frequently people will come and say, well, I've been voting here for years. How could I not be on the list? Or, there'll be someone will cross off the wrong name because we're still doing this all with paper and pencil, right there. So there are errors that occur, and that's when we have problems with the people not being able to vote.
So would instituting this new system also require a complete upgrade of technology at the polls, where you're checking people in and making sure that they're already on the list, that sort of thing?
Not really. I mean, the Election Day registration that's why we're having it all in one place, because you will have access to the statewide voter list at that one site. So hopefully within 5 years we'll have an internet-based system where you'll have a password-controlled system, and you'd have a laptop, at least one at every polling place. It's absolutely shocking that we don't have that now, quite frankly. We have not made any investment in our election system in years.
Right, and who controls the budget for that?
Well, no one. That's the problem. The towns basically have to pay, but they aren't really responsible for the registrars because they are elected officials. So they're in kind of this gray area, and that has been some of the problem. And right now the towns are squeezing their budgets.
Right, so registrars are elected officials, and in some respects they report to you. You have some kind of relationship to them?
Not really.
Not really.
That's what's also becoming very clear to me.
It seems like a problem.
The lines of authority are very weak, if any.
Who supervises the registrars?
Themselves. They are elected officials. There is no real supervision. Now, of course, they're all responsible for following the statutes.
Well, what if they mess up, like Bridgeport?
Well, it's a very good question. And as a matter of fact, we have a bill in this year for the first time that will allow for the removal of a registrar for cause. There is nothing in the statute. It
but
really
that's
is
after
sort
the
of
fact.
a whole. It is after the fact.
There's nothing in the statutes either today or proposed that would allow you to go in and say, you guys haven't shown in the past that you can do this properly, so we're going to run it for you?
Not really.
No.
We did obtain authority last year to come in and remove a moderator for cause, which is the one who's in charge of one polling place, who really, in effect, are in charge on that day.
Right.
Moderators really run our local election system. It's a local system. People sometimes have the mistaken impression that the state is in charge. It's not.
It's not.
No.
Wow. So you've got a lot of ideas up here, but you've got to get the cooperation of 169 registrars times 2, I guess, because most towns have 2. Hartford has 3, but that's an anomaly.
Yes.
So all of those registrars have to be on board, and then they have to bring along their moderators.
Well, we can pass laws that will say this is what you have to do, but then it's our job. We'll have to train them all, and get them all to do it properly.
Right.
And that's, it's a push and pull sort of thing.
Yeah.
Most of them really want to do a good job.
Of course.
And so it's just...
Why would you be in the job otherwise?
Exactly. A lot of them don't have the tools.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of these tiny little towns don't even have computers themselves in their town offices.
Really?
So, and we found out a third of the registrars don't have email. So it's difficult to even communicate with all of them. So these are the challenges, and frankly, I think in the next few years we're going to have to make an investment, probably from the state level, because there are many towns that just don't have the wherewithal to do this.
Right, and the investment, talking about a laptop in every registrar's office, that's not a lot.
No,
not a lot of money.
It's not.
I don't know how many voting precincts there are in the state. If you wanted to put one in each one of those, now it starts to get a little more exciting. But
yes, but it's still a relatively minor investment.
Well,
I mean, we found when we were studying this, I've had a task force looking at all this for the last year, we found that most towns spend less than 1% of their budget on elections. And I would argue that's one of their most important functions. But when it gets compared to things like education or even public works, it's way down on the scale.
Of course.
So I'm seeing ahead that we're going to have to make an investment. It isn't a huge investment, I don't think.
So you've got these bills in the legislature now, and I understand that the governor is behind them.
Absolutely.
And so that, I would think, makes it more likely that they're going to pass. What's your feeling? You know, how are they moving through committees? What's happening now?
Well, I think that's the only challenge, frankly, because I have broad bipartisan support for the constitutional amendment, online voter registration, and something we didn't talk about, which is increased penalties for voter intimidation at the polls.
All right.
We're also proposing some of that because we've seen some problems with that.
What have we seen? What problems?
Well, in the recent past, there have been situations where we've had some pretty ugly moments at some of the polling places with things like gang members being
Really?
threatening. There's been some threatening behavior, and when we looked at the statutes, we found that the penalties were quite low for these things. So in order to sort of make the point to people that we're not going to tolerate this kind of behavior, we are suggesting that the fines go up to $5,000 per incident so that it'll discourage it. I'm kind of worried about this coming election, to be perfectly honest.
Really?
Well, I think the country is deeply divided. I think it's going to be a very contentious election, and feelings are running pretty high, and there's a lot of money pouring in, and there will be money pouring into every state to hire people, not just for the negative ads, but to hire people to stand at the polls and witness things and bring complaints and that sort of thing. I think that's perfectly possible.
Really?
Yeah.
The standing at the polls and witnessing things generally is about challenging people's right to vote.
That's right.
And I know that people who say that Election Day registration is not a good idea often say, well, there's fraud. It's just going to increase the possibility of fraud, and we'll have, the elections will be somehow debased. What's your response to that?
This comes up all the time, everywhere I go. The fraud issue is a complete red herring. We have gone back, because I was so interested, I got asked about this so many times, when I think the real issue is that not enough people are voting. But even if I completely believe we ought to make sure that our voting system is accurate and people are who they say they are.
Of course.
I have no problem with that. But when it starts being used as a way to disenfranchise people, that's when you have to question the balance, I think, of a secure election versus people's right to vote. We went back 20 years in Connecticut. There is not one incident that's been reported of someone coming to a poll and claiming to be somebody they weren't.
Not even in Bridgeport.
Not even in Bridgeport. I mean, and now that's not to say that we haven't had mostly absentee ballot fraud accusations, and people have gone to jail, which is what should happen in a situation like that. So the system kind of works. We've struggled with how to stop this, and usually it's overzealous third parties or candidates helping the frail and the elderly fill out their ballots. That's been the vast majority of cases that have come to any kind of prosecution in the state.
But when you talk about absentee ballot cases in the last 20 years, how many of those have there been?
I couldn't tell you exactly, but not many. Not many. A handful.
A handful.
A handful.
And so it's highly unlikely that any election in the last 20 years has had their outcome altered because of fraud.
Exactly.
Either at the polls, which you say basically hasn't happened as far as we can figure out, or through the absentee ballots.
No. There's just no incidence of it, and I think it's a complete scare tactic that some people bring up. Now, that's not to say they may not think there is fraud. We're all we question everything now, and the government is very suspect in many people's minds of many things. So I think it is up to us, my office included, to ensure that elections are fair, open, and free from fraud. No question about it. But I think to question someone's right to vote at a polling place is a very serious matter. And this is people's right as an American to vote. And I think people have to remember that. Sometimes I think we get a little carried away with our bureaucratic sort of response to, is the paperwork in order? And in Connecticut, we do have fairly strong voter ID laws.
Mm-hmm.
They're in place. There is an exception if someone forgot their wallet or whatever. They can be pulled aside and seen if there's some way we can fix the situation, and if not, we give them a provisional ballot, which gives them a chance to vote provisionally. And then they either can go home and find their wallet or whatever, or they can, it'll be counted in case of a close election.
And that's though at the polling place.
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to circle back a little bit on how you want to run this, because to me the idea of doing it all in one place at the registrar's office, in a town, for example, like Westport, where we have, I think, 17 or 18,000 people vote.
Right.
If we had an extra 10% show up on election day who hadn't shown up, and if they all came to one place, which would be the registrar's office, that would be an extra 1,800 people.
Right.
That's a lot of people to handle in one day, to get them registered, to give them a ballot, to seal up that ballot, to put the ballot over on the side, and to count it. So that seems to me to be, I would think that the system might fall on its face at that point.
First of all, you're assuming a very large number, but
Yes.
even if you assume that happened, I come from stores.
Where
In the
stores where
2008,
there are all the college kids.
10,000 students
Right.
are eligible to vote in that district
Right.
when they reside at the campus.
Right.
In 2008, we had between 3,000 and 4,000 students come in for a presidential ballot, or because they were registered to vote there and vote there.
Mm-hmm.
And they all voted in the same polling place, which is Town Hall.
Mm.
And what we do is we put more tables out, and we have about 5 tables where maybe you would have had 2.
Mm-hmm.
It is not that overwhelming, and you'd be amazed at how quickly you can do this.
So people-
you'd have to have more help on
The
election
registrars
day.
would have to staff up.
Right.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it reduces a lot of other things. It reduces your need for provisional ballots, which are very time-consuming on election day because you have to separately deal with each person.
The presidential provisional ballots.
Yes,
Yes.
right. So you have vastly fewer provisional ballots.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it eliminates the need entirely for presidential ballot in a presidential year.
Right.
So it does reduce some things, and it also assumes that if those 1,800 people, they may have come in earlier to register, maybe because they knew they could come in on election day, they just postpone it a little bit. But again, you won't have so much work up front.
Mm-hmm.
And it is very efficient, actually, to get them registered on election day, because everybody's there, and you just go through it, and it's all done by computer. So we have, with the statewide list right there, it's much more efficient.
For those places that have the computer, which you've already said that there are several.
Well, they all have them at the one place.
Oh, do they?
They all have them at the central registrar's office,
Oh, okay.
usually, in
Okay.
town hall.
Uh-huh.
And if you have enough technology in your town hall, you can actually move it to a bigger room.
Right.
You just have to have your tech guys know how to move it, because it's a hard line. That's the problem. You're still tethered to that hard line.
Okay.
So if we need to overcome that.
So in your mind, there would be some expense at the local level.
A little bit.
People
Very
would have
small.
People would have to staff up a little bit on election
that's
day
right.
at that one place.
Yes.
And people who thought that they were going to be able to do this at the polls are going to see that, well, no, I can't do it there. I'm going to be redirected to town hall, and I'll do it there.
Yes.
And obviously, they'd have some fall off between people who got to the polls and said, well, I want to register, and they'd say, you can't, you got to go to town hall, and they'd say, well,
Yeah.
you'd have some.
We obviously have some educating to do
Right.
of the public. Any
Right.
change, you're
Right.
going to have to let people know that there's a change.
Right.
In general, though, as we're looking at other states, even when they made that change, 3 states have adopted this in the last couple of years: Iowa, Montana, and one other I'm forgetting. I think it was Rhode Island. They haven't really had a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had some of these town and city clerks on the line from these other states. In fact, I did a big conference call with all our registrars and the city clerks from Madison, Wisconsin, and a small town in Wisconsin. And they've been doing this for years. And well, Madison has a huge 40,000 student university in Madison.
Yes.
And they don't have computers. They've been doing this for 41 years. So obviously,
certainly didn't have computers
long
41
before we
that's
had,
right.
and they just
They
have
just
had
did it.
no problem.
Right.
They just did it.
Well, what about voting by mail, which they're doing out in Oregon? And,
Yes.
and in fact, I think they don't even have polling places anymore. I think everything's done by mail.
Correct.
Is
Very
that
inexpensive.
Very inexpensive.
Big cost cutter.
Yeah.
They love it. They're happy with it. I just read a report about it last night. They started it in 1995.
Mm-hmm.
They did it as a pilot program, first with a referendum, I believe. And people thought it worked so well. They were very skeptical at the
Sure.
beginning because, of course, people all want, Election Day. We're used to Election Day. They've had it since 1995 for all their elections. Once you vote in an election, they send you a ballot automatically, and you send it in when you're ready to vote. And it seems to work beautifully. It's about a tenth of the cost. And
Is that
they have
that
a
all
higher
on the-
voter turnout by far.
Is
They have
that
one
on
of
the
highest.
horizon for us, do you think?
Here, I think when people hear this, they just have a very negative reaction.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, again, we're back to the 169 towns and everybody wants to do it their own way. I don't know. People are all serious about cutting costs until it comes to something like this. And then no matter how much it saves, they're not so sure.
Well.
But we'll see. We may get there.
The last thing that I would love to see the change of thinking on is, instead of you having to register yourself, that the state simply registers you. You're a citizen,
Yep.
you're registered. Here's your ballot. Do it.
Actually, that's how it was until about 1860.
Wow.
And you might be able to guess why voter registration became so popular. There actually is still a state that does not require voter registration. I think it's South Dakota.
Well, everybody knows everybody in South Dakota.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. But, it really is a barrier.
It
Why not
is.
just use your social security number if nothing else?
Right.
Although
Although that's not so safe these days.
No, but it would at least identify a vast number of people without having to go through another whole process.
That's true. Well, I think this is exciting. It's a great leap forward, and I hope that it comes through, and I'd love to talk with you more about it as we get closer to implementation.
Thanks very much. I'm excited about it.
Great. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, John.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. You can find all our shows on YouTube by going to youtube.com/user/DFATVNet. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. Or you can send comments or suggestions for a show to info@dfa-tv.net. If you'd like to learn more about progressive political action, we meet at 7 p.m. on the first Wednesday of the month at the Silver Star Diner in Norwalk. We'd love to have you join us. Remember, change is possible, and you can make it happen. This has been Stream of Conscience, and I'm your host, John Hartwell. Thanks for watching.